Vice Sting. Sometimes bored housewives turn to places like Craigslist just to sell it. And then in every major American city, they walk in the corners. Call girls, go see older men just for money. And some of the swankiest parties in Hollywood have some of the kink.
19 Sergeant Essential. 19 Sergeant.
On this week's edition of Vice Sting, stick with us, because we're taking you to the nitty-gritty streets of the Big Apple. That's right, New York City. Our mission? To reveal the back doors and side entrances of one of the largest prostitution rings operating within the 5 boroughs of New York proper. We'll show you how the purveyors of happy endings were brought to justice. Fair warning, the occupation and background of the ringleaders of this illegal organization may surprise you. It sure as hell surprised them when they were eventually raided and arrested. And now, Vice Sting. Good evening, and welcome to this weekend's episode of Vice Sting. Investigators of this story, courtesy of the New York Times. Today we ask the question, what would happen if a vice detective skilled in the ways of disrupting and breaking up prostitution rings decided to go into business for himself as a pimp? Well, that is exactly what transpired between him and 8 other New York City police officers and a countless number of civilians in the month of September of 2017 in a sting labeled Operation Zap. By then, complaints from neighbors about prostitution flourishing behind the Brooklyn apartments' thin walls had been flowing into the Vice Squad for months with no answer. Men arriving at all hours of the night were asked at the door which nationality women they preferred, Brazilian or Peruvian. The mastermind of that prostitution ring was none other than ex-vice detective Ludwig Paz. Ludwig Paz was an Ecuadorian immigrant who was raised in the Catholic faith, along with his second wife and partner in crime, Aurelius Peralta. Detective Paz was charged with running a $2 million a year in annual earnings, illegal gambling, and prostitution ring that spanned a vast array of the city's boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens and spilled over into Long Island. But how did Detective Paz get here from his Catholic upbringing and his first assignment as a cop? As a newbie, Patrolman Officer Paz was assigned to the 84th Precinct, covering the brownstones and cobblestones of Brooklyn Heights and Vinegar Hill, New York City. Now, back then he was known as Panya, a slang term for partner. One officer who was actually his partner, Officer Giancarlo Raspananti, was perhaps the first of the 7 he would work beside over the years. Their friendship would endure for over 2 decades later, despite the direction Officer Paz took with his life. Officer Raspanti would end up in handcuffs alongside with Detective Paz when they were arrested for the prostitution ring. I guess the saying is true, that birds of a feather flock together. By the end of the year 2002, Detective Paz had earned a coveted position on the Brooklyn Vice Squad, where he learned like no one else the inner workings of the street crime and its most sordid details. There's one thing in performing an external investigation into a prostitution ring, but there is an altogether different ballgame to gaining the trust and infiltrating the realm of pimps and prostitutes by learning to speak their language. Many say by all accounts, Detective Paz was a quick study. Along the way, he met several other officers whose name in the far-off year of 2018 would appear beside his in a sweeping indictment detailing corruption and prostitution. Among them, Giovanni Rojas Acosta, Carlos Cruz, Cliff Nieves, and most notably for his actions as described by the police, Rene Samaniego, who would tell pimps when undercover officers were planning to visit a brothel and describe what they would look like in detail. The operation in one location didn't appear too anxious at hiding the goings-on and comings of the clients. These guys were pretty blatant, said a worker at a nearby business who asked to remain anonymous. He said that you'd see a half dozen guys coming and going at the same time. I always wondered why it was so obvious. Now, a former tenant at the Gowanus building said she started reporting a sex operation to the police in January of the year 2017, after she noticed lots of men visiting and talk of massage tables. She said nothing happened to the location after she filed a report. At one point, a detective from the Vice Squad told her that sex trade was an impossible to stamp out, he said, and that he suggested that she just move on, find another location to live. When the police finally came to the location with the battering ram in September of 2017, nothing was there. The location had been tipped off about the impending raid. Similar scenes were happening elsewhere across the city. Seven Britt, a musician who lived in a building on Foster Avenue in Ditmas Park, said he first noticed a brothel there in September of the year 2015. This is 2 years before. He said it advertised hot Latinas and tight security and total discretion. He said he repeatedly called the police all the way through August of 2017 to report the brothel and visited the nearby 70th precinct in person to report the issue. And again, nothing happened. They never even bothered to get in touch with Mr. Britt. It seemed by all accounts that whoever was running that particular operation and brothel was untouchable. But let us look into the motive of Detective Paz joining a life of crime. By all accounts, he was said to be in a happy marriage to his first wife, Sonia, and their young son. The family lived in the same small building above an auto parts store of Detective Paz's parents. He and Mrs. Paz went to comedy clubs in Manhattan. Detective Paz took his son to the arcade and hikes in the state parks. His son had these kind words to say about his father growing up. He was my hero, he said, because in my eyes, police officers were the ones who did the right thing. His son, now 28, said in a recent interview, but in everyone's life, a little rain must fall. By the mid-2000s, Detective Paz's family life began to crumble. He had met another woman, apparently, through his work on the Vice Squad. Law enforcement officials said the woman, Aurelius Peralta, was inside of a brothel that the Vice Squad raided. Though they did not say where she was there, Detective Paz let her slip out of the back door when the police arrived. The detective and Mrs. Peralta began a romance shortly thereafter. This new relationship was unbeknown to his first wife, who had moved to Puerto Rico and was waiting for him to join her and their son at their location. But instead, Detective Paz asked Mrs. Paz for a divorce. By November of 2006, he had moved to a single-family house in Ozone Park, Queens. At that time, he was with his new love interest, Mrs. Peralta. Back then, Detective Paz, perhaps thinking back to the cramped building above that auto parts store, did what a lot of Americans do. By some accounts, Paz was a model New York PD cop prior to a messy divorce in 2008. Now, after that divorce, Sonia, it resulted in big alimony payments being automatically deducted from his New York PD paycheck. Paz then went looking for ways to supplement his income. He borrowed too much money, and like a lot of others in 2008, he was swept into a financial crisis, failing to make monthly payments on his subprime mortgage loans and filing for bankruptcy. Detective Paz owed more than $690,000 on a subprime mortgage, according to court records. That same year, he earned only $120,000 on his police salary, with overtime included. On a later wiretap, the law enforcement official said he was heard telling an associate that he started working in prostitution in 2008. I wonder why. Not as an arresting officer, but as a player, Detective Paz subsequently retired from the force in the year 2010, 2 years later. Once he had achieved his 20-year mark as an officer, it's a certain saying, 20 and I'm out. But Detective Paz could not have sustained an operation with as much sophistication in a major American city without the highest number of police officers, without a lookout, and informants to assist him. Prosecutors said Detective Rene Samaniego told pimps when undercover officers were planning to visit a brothel and describe what they looked like over the phone. Over the phone, Samaniego would simply say, "Expect visitors today." These calls came from Mr. Paz at all hours of the night. Mostly it was Detective Samaniego from the Vice Squad. Mr. Paz would listen, hang up and call one of his brothels, said law enforcement officials, who has listened to wiretaps recording of the conversations. Now, Detective Paz calling to warn one of his brothel houses would say this: "My friend has said that you are to expect visitors today." And then they knew what to do. They would shut the place down. Other calls were more specific. It was said that Mr. Paz never sounded panicked over the phone, but always relaxed. On other calls to warn his brothels pimps, Mr. Paz would say, "Hey, the UC is walking up the block," according to prosecutors, using the abbreviation for an undercover officer. In this case, Paz was referencing an Asian, he said, with a beard. In hindsight, it would seem reckless for a retired detective to speak so openly over the telephone. Now, detectives on the case said, if we believe what he said, that he was doing this since 2008, he's been doing it for 10 years, and for so long, and nothing happening to him, he just carried on his business as usual. So why not speak freely on the phone, they said. The officers working with Mr. Paz helped him in many ways, the police said. Some watched the door at the brothels collecting cash. They arrested his competition when needed be. And when some of Mr. Paz's sex workers were arrested in unforeseen raids, officers looked up the arrest records to glean potential damaging information to protect Mr. Paz's operations. The fear of an arrested sex worker employee flipping an informant on the operation was a constant threat. According to prosecutors, an apartment in this building center in Park Slope, Brooklyn, was used as a brothel. This would be the location of the takedown on Detective Paz's operation. Only this time, there were no warnings. On Wednesday, September the 12th, the police waited until 1 p.m. when the brothels were open for business, and they struck 3 of them very quickly, arresting everyone they found at one location. Officers even handcuffed a 72-year-old building superintendent who, after convincing them he had nothing to do with the crimes, was finally released. Can you imagine? A 72-year-old guy. Now, the raids were a culmination of investigation that started with the 2015 telephone tip to the Internal Affairs Bureau. It came from a police officer. 3 years later, the tipster, still unnamed, will be praised by Commissioner James P. O'Neill at a news conference as a cop who recognized that the behaviors and actions of even one of its members reflects on every single member of this police department. Thousands of hours of surveillance and recordings of calls had been collected. The investigation took so long because of its secrecy, the police said. Policing the police without tipping off the officers brings its challenges with it. Still, a police spokesman, Philip Walshek, said the department was investigating whether there were instances, now, when the crimes described in the case could have been detected much sooner. So when your police are inspecting police, they still have to find out, is it somebody inside or a middleman not to be trusted? Thus far, those efforts had not identified such an instance. Ms. Walshek said Internal Affairs routinely conducts integrity tests in search of corruption, he said. Those tests are more frequent and much improved from years past. Mr. Paz and Ms. Peralta were the first to be arrested, handcuffed at Kentucky International Airport, where they were waiting to board a flight to Las Vegas vacation. Imagine, they weren't trying to skip town. They never knew the arrest was coming. But oddly enough, their luggage left without them to that destination. A search of their home yielded over $20,000 in cash, the police said. Mr. Paz and the arrested officers all entered pleas of not guilty that week. officials said they did not anticipate more officers being arrested unless new information surfaced. By the time top police brass gathered in one police plaza to announce the arrest, the case had been assigned a code name, Operation Zap, because it was the name of former vice detective accused of running the syndicate, spelled backwards, or PAZ, P-A-Z. But investigators on the case had already chosen a different code name, one that spoke to the nature of the crime said to have been masterminded by the former vice detective, named Ludwig Paz. They called it Protection Detail. Ludwig Paz and his second wife, Aurelius Peralta, both pled guilty to charges surrounding a criminal prostitution and gambling ring run by the couple, with Paz facing a much different sentence for more serious charges. His wife, who rejected a plea deal with a much tougher sentence, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of attempted enterprise corruption. The former detective Paz was fined only $20,000 along with 4 to 12 years in prison. His wife Peralta received a sentence of 1 day shy of a year in jail, which was significantly lighter than the 4-year term she walked away from in the original plea deal. Last year, 7 NYPD cops, including the 3 NYPD sergeants and 2 detectives, were also charged for their role in Paz's retirement enterprise. Imagine. Now, in exchange for cash payments of $500, Brooklyn South Vice Detective Rene Samaniego and other cops would tip Paz off before the NYPD raided locations where the ringleader and his wife operated their illicit gambling and prostitution operations. Samaniego and other officers would also give Paz physical descriptions of undercover NYPD detectives that were headed to those brothels. The gambling operation was fairly mundane, with Paz getting behind a neighborhood numbers racket in Queens that operated out of a local deli and a hair salon. But the prostitution business was bigger and much more complex than one could imagine. Samaniego took a plea deal early this month and could be sentenced to up to 6 years in prison. Officer Giancarlo Raspante allegedly traded an NYPD info to Paz for discounted hooker sex at the brothels, while Sergeant Luis Falia is accused of abetting the ringleader by using NYPD computer data while on duty to inform Paz about goings-on in the department that could affect the criminal enterprise that he had. Mr. Paz is in protective custody in jail, and his lawyer declined to be interviewed for this article. But his rise and fall was pieced together by reporters on the New York Times, who conducted dozens of interviews with current and former law enforcement personnel. Mr. Paz's family members and others. Now, the reporters also visited locations of brothels and gambling parlors across the city. The interviews and court records portrayed a crime boss who relied heavily upon 7 police officers he had met over his years on the job to be his crew, his legmen, his doormen, his bagmen, and much more, his henchmen. Most important, they were Mr. Paz's inside men, tipping him off to raids and betraying one of the most sacred trusts in law enforcement: the identities of undercover officers. Wiretaps revealed Mr. Paz's contact with the officers on the force, who were later arrested and accused of being his accomplices. The contents of those wiretaps were recounted to the Times by senior law enforcement officials. The syndicate thrived because of its secret weapons. All 7 of them, and yet it was done from within. Inside, the blue wall finally was cracked. The whistleblower, who was a fellow police officer, who called the Internal Affairs Bureau with the tip. Now, the police said the brothel in Brooklyn, including at 880 Gates Avenue and in Queens, were in bedrooms with dirty mattresses on the floor and a bottle of air freshener within arm's reach. Can you imagine? After all of the years on the Vice Squad, after all of the honor and integrity that he earned and deserved, that he ends up trading sex for millions of dollars for low mattresses on the floor. For Vice Sting, this is Charles Rivers. Tune in next week when we go after another case of prostitution. We'll see you then.
I said I never gave a fuck. Less is about them bucks. My frame on Donald Trump. So you suckers out of luck. I'm probably somewhere with my Brazilian. Contemplate chasing paper till we hit 1 million. Like fly like Bonnie. Protected by an army. No weapon that's forming against Michelle Harmon. I'm folding up the dollars with a style origami. Cause I'm getting to the paper. No 50 cents.